Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The question of when do you know if you're right? When do you know if you have insight? When do you know that the answer is truly correct that you're getting, or that you are merely guessing and going forward on assumptions? This question was often asked, and the answer came something like this. When there's a spontaneity in your answer, when it comes immediately and it comes without doubt, then you have reached an interaction with reality, and reality has answered you. It is the difference between conscious striving and divine spontaneity. Now, each of us is capable of divine spontaneity. Each of us has within us the ability to be free of all of the turmoil of the world that causes indecision and doubt and makes us question everything. And we have the ability to be rid of that and get to the point where we can get answers directly as to our situation. But to do that, we have to believe that it's possible, and we have to be free of the influence of the world, the influence of the mind, and the influence of everything that is trying to push you one way or the other. God's opinion is always the correct opinion. God's idea is always the correct idea. The question is, for each of us, how is it that we can tune in to God's idea? How is it that we can tune in to the correct idea? How is it that we can tune in to reality? Well, in order for us to be able to tune in to reality, we have to tune out of our attachments to this world. We have to tune out of all of the ideas that the world gives us. God's ideas and the world's ideas do not necessarily coincide. And the world's ideas are always attached to a lot of different qualities. Qualities such as self-motive, self-aggrandizement, the hope that there will be some kind of profit in the answer. The ability to cleanse yourself of self-motive, to cleanse yourself of a need from everything that bypasses you. You know, the common answer to these kinds of situations is, what's in it for me? If you can get away from what's in it for me and come up with a response that has nothing to do with the individual personal self, this body that walks this earth, then the chance of getting closer to getting a spontaneous divine answer is much better. As we go through life, we have to ask ourselves, what is the amount of time we spend pondering our decisions? What is the amount of time we spend looking into what it is that we want to do? Do we come up with something, and then do we do something else? Do we come up with something and then beat it to death with our mind to where we end up a few days later in the midst of confusion? Everybody who grew up in the United States went through testing while they were in school. And I'm talking about these standardized tests. And one of the pieces of advice that I was given, and I assume everybody else was given when these standardized tests were given, is that your first thought of the answer is probably the right one. But when you begin to overthink it and you begin to look and look and look and look, you're probably drawn away from the right answer. Well, it's like that with all of our situations. Allah is always with us. Allah gives us answers. Allah speaks to us, but we have to have the ears to hear, and we have to have the insight to understand. And how do we develop the ears to hear and the insight to understand? We do it by developing certain kinds of qualities within our being. We have to become people, as the prophet put it, of the middle way. We can't be too severe. We have to begin to understand that spontaneity, true spontaneity, comes internally. And we have to have a clarity in our inner self in order to be able to understand that. We all talk about unity all the time, but what we notice if we look at the world is there are people who can't fathom internal unity. They can't fathom a unity amongst all men. So what is it that they do? They try to create an external unity. Everybody has to look a certain way. Everybody has to talk a certain way. Everybody has to pray a certain way. The burqa, the veil that covers a woman entirely, is a type of unity. It's a type of unity that makes all women equal and makes them all look alike. However, it also takes away all their rights, all their privileges, and all their humanity. But nobody takes that into consideration because now they've found an external methodology for creating unity among all of them within that society. And as opposed to calling it slavery, they call it culture. So the world will constantly make excuses for what it does, but it will continue to do what it does. And it will get very angry with you if you object to it in any way. We have to learn, again, the middle path. We have to learn that when things are of no consequence, we should not make them of consequence. We shouldn't create storms where there's no need for them. We shouldn't make mountains out of molehills. We shouldn't insist on things that don't need to be insisted on. There was a jailer who was taking care of the prisoners that he was in charge of, and they fed them twice a day. They fed them in the morning and they fed them in the evening. In the morning, they would give them 40% of their ration, and in the evening, they would give them 60% of the ration. And the prisoners complained. They said they wanted 60% of their ration in the morning and 40% of their ration in the evening. So now the jailer has a dilemma. If he looks at the situation rationally, he understands that they're not asking for anything more than what they're getting. They're just asking for it at a different time. So he has to make a decision. Should he accommodate them, or should he maintain the superiority of his will and the insistence that whatever he wills is what has to be done? The advanced being will do what the prisoners want because it doesn't make any difference. The stubborn, small man will insist on doing things the way he wants. He'll end up with disgruntled prisoners. He'll end up with discipline problems. He'll end up with all kinds of headaches because of his insistence that he wanted it to be right. The man of higher consciousness sees unity. The man of lower consciousness sees separations. And to maintain his state of superiority, the man of lower consciousness has to insist on separations because control comes through separations. Status comes through separations. High and low comes through separations. So whenever you see a situation that has lots of separations in it, you can be very aware of the fact that this is an understanding that doesn't see unity. It doesn't see equality. It is trying to enforce separations, to enforce status. The entire caste system, which separates society into segments, is essentially based on the fact of maintaining a hierarchy of status within the society and making that status permanent as opposed to flexible. Kingdoms have a way of doing that, where you have long established caste systems. There's a way of doing that. And to drive these out of society is very, very difficult and takes years and years and years. India, which has a long-standing caste system and then developed an idea of reincarnation that enforces the idea of the caste system, still hasn't been able to strike it from their society, even though it's been outlawed years ago during the time of Gandhi. So for each of us, we have to look at what are the separations that we create in our own life. And we have to understand that as we create separations, we go further and further away from the truth. The world is full of opposites: joy and sorrow, praise and blame. God alone is, I am not. These seem to be opposites, but the man of wisdom sees the unity in these things and understands the unity in these things. And let me give you one incredibly important example. We repeat, La ilaha illallah. I am not, only God is. I am not, only God is. I am not, only God is. And then Halaj came along and said, Anal Haq. I am reality. The separation disappears because of the merging and the unity. I am not disappears into I am. And then I am is all there is. And it's that way with all of these opposites. The one who can understand the unity of things can understand beyond the separation of things and can see the lie in the separation of things. So races are not separate. They're all one. There are artificial distinctions that people make, and these artificial distinctions are purposefully held in place to give certain people status and not to allow other people to rise. But if we want to become a true being, if we want to have divine spontaneity, we can't have those kinds of attitudes within this world. In order to become divinely attuned, we have to be rid of all the things that aren't divine. And separating ourselves from others is not divine. Creating differences between ourselves and others is not divine. Causing these kinds of traumas is not divine. If we truly intend to touch divinity, to understand divinity, to get to the point of Anal Haq, then everything that separates us from that state must be separated from us. And what separates us from that state is all of the separations in the world. Somehow, we have to come to the position where we see divinity in everything. And if we see divinity in everything, then we see no differences. Now, one of the things that happens because of the way men are, people will come along and they will explain that there needs to be a certain order to things. And in order for that to be accomplished, everybody has to fall in step. Well, we're not all the same, but that doesn't mean we're not equal. We can't be forced to fall in step, because as soon as that begins to occur, disasters begin to happen. You can't force a society to move in a direction or move in another direction. You have to allow a certain amount of freedom for people to go the way they are inclined to go, right or wrong. Now, I'm not talking about civil disobedience, and I'm not talking about crime. I'm talking within civil society, people have to have the ability to form their own opinions about things. Now, there is one truth, and God willing, everyone will come to that truth eventually, but not everyone is going to come there at the same time and in the same way. And if you have a government that's trying to force this truth upon people, it's going to end up in disaster. It's going to end up in millions and millions of deaths. Witness Mao Zedong in China, who killed approximately 40 million people. Witness Stalin in Russia, who killed 20 million people at least, and maybe millions more. I just saw a documentary about some of the things that happened in Russia, and they were trying to make communes out of all the farms and produce enough food for the whole country. But unfortunately, Stalin ended up killing most of the farmers, which made it very difficult to produce food. So the solution was to build factories to produce tractors to industrialize the farms in order to try and overcome what they had done to the farmers. The point is that you can't bring about communion through enforcing communion. It's only brought about through love. But you also can't force love. Love has to be put out there as a alternative to whatever is going on, and as an alternative to take you further in your progress as a conscious individual. The only way that truth can be brought to people is through love. But not everybody is willing to accept love, which means not everybody is willing to accept truth, nor will everybody be willing to accept truth. And if they don't accept truth, it is not within our permitted action to force them to accept truth. And this forcing of the acceptance of what we consider truth makes people into tyrants. The inability to allow other opinions to exist in opposition to your own opinion creates a tyrannical situation, creates a situation that cannot be handled by most people. And what happens is you end up with civil disobedience, you end up with undergrounds, you end up with revolutions, you end up with civil wars, you end up with all kinds of bizarre reactions through people's attempts to enforce one set of opinions over society. But we're not so interested in what goes on in society. What we're interested in is what's going on inside of ourselves. What's going on with us and what's going on with our own attempt to obtain higher consciousness. A window is a hole in a wall. Yet, this one hole in a wall allows light to fill the entire room or the entire house. Now, think about your heart. Your heart can be closed or your heart can be open. If the heart is open and allows light to go in it, that heart of yours can enlighten everybody it comes into contact with. But it can only do that if it is in the light. If it is hard, it can't do that. If it is a rock, it can't do that. It has to be opened and it has to give forth light. Somehow that has to occur. And we have to be the ones that make it happen. So what is it that we have to do? We have to stop being stubborn. We have to be able to hear other opinions. You know, unless you open your ears and you open your eyes, you can't see and you can't hear. And if you refuse to see and hear, you become a tyrant. You become one who produces situations that bring about difficult situations. If there are too many rules, and if these rules become more important than the state of the heart, the same thing happens. And these almost become silly. Religions talk about how you have to grow your beard. Religions talk about how you have to grow your hair. Religions talk about how you have to wear your clothes. What do these things have to do with the state of your heart? The imam was preaching to the choir, to the congregation. And in the middle of his speech, he says, and the way you can tell a good Muslim is by the length of his beard and how groomed his beard is. And then Nasruddin stands up and he says, well, my goat must be a very, very good Muslim because his beard is longer than anybody's here and much more luxurious. It's like that. When the truth is evident, rules aren't necessary. When the truth isn't evident, sometimes you need rules to bring the truth into being. But as you come closer to the truth, less and less rules are necessary because you've reached a state where you don't have to be told what to do. You know what to do. This is divine spontaneity, because all of a sudden you are in tune with that which is real. And the more superficiality you pile on, the less you can be in touch with what is real. The more that you make rules as to what's real, the more you are removed from what's real. There are no absolutes in this world. The only absolute is God. And when you try to create absolutes in the world, you're ending up nullifying that which you are attempting to create. You're creating a situation that is further from the truth the more and more and more rules you put in place to try and bring about the truth. And what you end up with is culture as opposed to truth. And what goes on in many parts of the world is culture has become religion. Culture has become the connection to God. Culture has become what people have to do in order to be accepted within society, and the society then claims that that's what has to be done to be accepted by God. This is the reality of what everyone deals with. This is the reality of what's going on day in, day out, all through the world. And who is around to dispute these kinds of assertions? Well, there are the Sufis. And the Sufis come and explain and bring about every certain number of years a resurgence of truth within the religion. They explain the truth within the religion again and again and again. And by the way, in certain parts of the world, Sufis are hunted and killed for that very reason, because when the truth hits culture, when the truth hits superficial restrictions, when the truth comes in contact with these kinds of things, it causes disruptions because it takes away the power from the ones who are holding power and gives power back to the individual and says the individual and his relationship to God is an individual matter, not a matter of the state and the state enforced ideas. So we, living in America, thank God, have the freedom to decide how to move forward in our religious life. Bawa used to say to us, he said, women and men should each thank God 7 times a day at least that they live in America, because here you have the opportunity to be free in your movement in religion. I was giving a talk in at the University of Maryland to a group of Hindus who were talking about forced conversion. And there were some swamis from various parts of the world. And most of the speakers were Hindu, but they wanted a Sufi point of view. And Sufism is based, wears the cloak of Islam. And I gave a talk, and it was the way I talk about restriction and freedom. And afterwards, one of the swamis came up to me and asked me where I was from, because they didn't expect that someone who could talk about Sufism was from the United States. So he wanted to know my origins. And I told him I had learned all this in the United States. And he said, that's very interesting, because if you said these same kinds of things in most parts of the world, they would kill you on the spot. And we don't appreciate that in this country. We don't appreciate that we have the freedom to find the truth, where in many places, the attempt to find truth is punishable by death. And that's not a joke, it's just the way it is. So we need to be thankful that we're in this country, and we need to appreciate what this country does for us. And we have to understand that what this country does for us is not done for people in many, many different parts of the world. And so it goes. So is our span in this earth. So is our time here. We have a limited amount of time within this carnation. And the question is, will we accomplish what we have to do within this incarnation in order to move on to the next incarnation? And the next incarnation is without this body. So we have to begin to live within this body as if we didn't have this body. And that's a major change in our attitude and in the way we are. So we have to begin to do things that doesn't try to somehow promote ourselves. We have to give up self-motive. We have to be able to release ourselves from the confines of our own body and be able to see ourselves in everyone else, be able to see ourselves as unified with all the rest of creation, to be able to see ourselves as one equal being, even though we're all different. That eventually, over time and the occurrence of the movement of consciousness, everyone can end up in the same place. That even though we seem so different, there is an underlying unity that we have to recognize and understand. Allah is in everything. He is in each and every one of us. There was a sheikh giving a lecture, and the dervishes were sitting around, and there was a knock on the door, and one of the dervishes went to the door and opened the door, and it was a beggar. And he said, "Can I have a piece of bread?" And he said, "Come back tomorrow. Right now the sheikh is talking and we're busy." And he closed the door. When he sat down, the sheikh said, "What happened?" He said, "There was a beggar who asked for a loaf of bread." And he said, "What did you do?" He said, "I told him to come back tomorrow because we were busy." And the sheikh said, "If God saw fit to give him a soul, who am I to withhold a loaf of bread from him? Go get a loaf of bread out of the kitchen, find him and give it to him." There is this connection between all of us. We have to understand this connection. And as opposed to trying to separate from each other, we have to unify with each other. And we do this through love and through kindness and through God's qualities. And if we refuse to do it, we are harming our own soul, because our soul longs for unity, even though our body longs for separation. So we have to understand the difference between unity and separation, and we have to be able to see unity in existence. And as we see that, we will become closer to the truth. As we become closer to the truth, we become closer to the divinity. As we become closer to the divinity, we will know the answers to our questions as soon as we ask them. We will know reality as we look out on things. It'll all open up, but as long as we separate ourselves, we create the veils that separate us from the truth. So in unity, the veils disappear. In separations, the veils are created. So we need to go to the state where we dissolve the veils, not create them. And we have to ask God for help in this, because we can't do anything on our own. I do not exist, only God exists. So God has to do it. And when God does it, that's when reality comes into play for each and every one of us. May that be our fate. May that be the path we walk on. May that be what occurs for us. Ameen. Ameen. Ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.